Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to Abralin ao Vivo Linguists Online. We hope you are safe and healthy. My name is Alessandra Castilho, and I work at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte in the city of Natal, Brazil. Tonight, I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker, Professor Dr. Johannes Kabatek. But first, let me remind you that Linguists Online is promoted by the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralin, in cooperation with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentinian Society of Language Studies, the Linguistic Society of America, the Sociedad Lingüística Europea, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. Johannes Kabatek has studied Romance philology, political science, and musicology at the universities of Tübingen and Malaga, and is a full professor of Romance linguistics at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. He is the director of the Latin America Center and of the Center of Galician Studies of Zurich. Kabatek is also a member of the Zurich Center for Linguistics, of the Royal Galician Academy, and of the Royal Spanish Academy. He was president of several scientific associations, such as the German Association of Hispanists, the German Association of Catalanists, the International Federation of Associations of Catalanists, and recently he has been elected for president of the Sociedad Lingüística Europea, the European Linguistic Society, beginning his term in August this year. Besides all that, he is director of the Revista Internacional de Linguística Ibero-Americana. Kabatek has been a visiting professor at many universities in the US, Latin America, and Spain, and has more than 150 scientific publications dedicated to various issues, such as historical syntax, corpus linguistics, language and text, theory of linguistic change, semantics, variational linguistics, social linguistics, pragmatics, language contact, languages of Spain, history of Portuguese, among others. I would like to highlight some of his publications, such as Os Falantes como Linguistas, Tradición, Inovación e Interferências no Galego Actual, from 2000, Lengua Medieval e Tradiciones Discursivas en la Península Ibérica, Descripción Gramatical, Pragmática Histórica, Metodología, from 2001, Las Lenguas de España, Política Lingüística, Sociología del Lenguaje e Ideología desde la transición hasta la actualidad, from 2006, Sintaxis Histórica del Español y Cambio Lingüístico, Nuevas Perspectivas desde las Tradiciones Discursivas, from 2008, Spanische Sprachwissenschaft, from 2009, Linguística Coseriana, Linguística Histórica, Tradiciones Discursivas, from 2018, among many other works which have a decisive impact in this area. The title of tonight's talk is Discourse Traditions and Grammar. During Professor Kabatek's lecture, you can post your comments and questions in English or Portuguese in the YouTube chat, and he's going to address them after the talk. So, Johannes, it's a great pleasure for us to have you here tonight. Thank you for doing this and welcome.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, for this really nice presentation. Thank you all for being here. Good night, good evening. It's already quite late here. It's midnight here in Europe. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here, and I would like to thank Alessandra for this exhaustive presentation. I would like to thank Miguel Oliveira from Abralin, who is the main organizer of this event. And also a special thank to Ataliba Teixeira Castillo, who, as I think, was the person who proposed me to participate in this initiative. It is a wonderful and really great initiative in very difficult times. We are currently testimonies of a medial revolution within this tremendous moment of the pandemic. After the invention of emails and WhatsApps, Zoom is becoming an everyday tool for communication, and it makes us feel extremely close within distance. Paradoxically, we are very close and very distant at the same time. No one would have thought a few years ago that the internet could become so stable in so short terms, and that almost the whole world, at least the world that can afford it, continues to exist and to communicate in this alternative world that has been created by modern engineering. This is also a revolution for communication, obviously, and language, and you had several talks in the Abralin cycle about this impact of the pandemic on communication. And we will see what the linguistic consequences of this new medium will be. Eu não sabia muito bem que língua falar, mas pensei que seria melhor falar em inglês, porque não todo mundo no público fala português. Ao melhor eu me erro, e tem mais pessoas falando melhor português do que inglês, mas isso não se pode saber pela dislocação temporal entre esta fala e a recepção. Dou as boas-vindas então aos presentes e aos futuros e peço desculpa pela decisão idiomática. Vocês podem, evidentemente, fazer perguntas em português sem problema no bate-papo. Estamos criando as tradições discursivas do Zoom e dos podcasts na atualidade, e em poucos anos será algo tão comum como agora é o e-mail, o WhatsApp, o ensaio científico ou qualquer outro texto. Before I start my talk on discourse traditions, I would like to briefly say a few words about Brazil and Brazilian linguistics. It's not by coincidence that the world of linguistics is coming together in this Abralin initiative. Brazil is one of the countries in the world where linguists from very different disciplines and ideologies collaborate, and where it is possible that functionalists, generativists, and structuralists join with historians, sociologists, and others in the same project. The bridges built by linguists, as my already mentioned friend Ataliba Teixeira Castillo, are wonderful examples for how collaboration is more likely to produce productive results than separation and confrontation. I'm currently writing a book on Eugenio Coserio, who participated in the 1960s in those linguistic wars that led to the separation of linguistic schools and ideologies that still mark the present. But already in the 1960s, Coserio said in his Panorama of Ibero-American Linguistics, and I quote, "A great development can be expected, first of all, in Brazil." End of quotation. And he adds that the level of the universities will allow Brazilian linguists to play an important role in future generations. Today, Brazilian linguists are active worldwide. And this initiative does not only bring international linguistics to Brazil, it also brings Brazilian linguistics to the world. So thanks, really, thanks a lot, Abralin, to this wonderful initiative. But I would like to say a few words, and let me maybe open my presentation. I would like to say a few words tonight and it's really tonight because it's really after midnight already, about an issue that should be rather uncontroversial. My talk is about discourse traditions and grammar. The first reaction to the title will obviously depend on how familiar you are with the concept of discourse traditions. But for many linguists, the term discourse tradition will probably sound as something not related to grammar. Grammar is grammar and usage is usage, and discourse traditions sound rather like being part of usage and not related to grammar. However, as I would like to show tonight, what we call discourse traditions, a concept several research groups in Brazil are quite familiar with, among others, Alessandra Castilho, who so kindly presented me. This concept is directly related to grammar, and not only in historical linguistics. So what I'm going to do tonight is, this doesn't work, so, okay. So what I'm going to do tonight will be, in first place, to define what discourse traditions are and how this concept was generated. Then I'll give us a few examples that show the relationship between discourse tradition and historical grammar and grammaticalization. Towards the end of the talk, I will say something about the importance of the concept also for synchronic linguistics, in particular for pragmatics and sociolinguistics. The examples I'm going to use to illustrate what I'm talking about will mainly be Romance examples, many of them from Brazilian Portuguese and some Spanish ones too, but the phenomena as such are general and not restricted to any particular language. But let me start with a short example. In these days, when I write emails to a person I didn't have any contact to in the last 2 or 3 months, I generally write the message with the content I want to tell, and then before sending the email, I send a few, I add a few words about the current situation, generally asking if my interlocutor is fine and asking about his or her family. Alessandra just said in the presentation, we hope you are safe and healthy. And this is also part of this new COVID-19 discourse traditions. This is something I do in English as well as in Spanish or in German, so it's not language specific. I end with a formula like stay healthy or bleiben Sie gesund in German. Politeness formula are of course not new. The Corona health formula tradition is linked to other formulae of politeness, like I hope this email finds you well, a very common formula that can be traced back until the 18th century letter writing traditions in English. But it also appears in a similar way in other languages. Here you see some corpus examples from we hope this email finds you well, where the email itself is looking for something, so it's an agentive email. This email finds you well can be traced back in the British National Corpus. We find a formula, this is an example, number 2 from 1991, hoping this finds you well, but we can trace it back until the 18th century or even earlier. May these lines find you well and happy. So we see that there is a discourse tradition, a tradition of a special formula that appears also in other languages. I was quite astonished when the first time I saw in Spanish someone writing me, espero que mi mensaje te encuentre bien, and this was obviously a translation of I hope this message finds you well. The hope this message finds you well tradition is of course not linked to COVID-19, but the formula like stay healthy, bleiben Sie gesund, votos de boa saúde, and others can be linked to the new Corona tradition. And we still have to wait if these formula are going to be conventionalized, and if these formula will create a new tradition. So this is a discourse tradition, a traditional way of saying things. The example, I hope this email finds you well, or also the bleiben Sie gesund, or the stay healthy. And it's not restricted to any particular language. We can look at this kind of traditions as we can investigate the tradition of newspapers from the 18th century onwards, or tradition of letters or emails. As you can see, this has absolutely nothing to do with grammar at first glance. And it is even questionable if it's a linguistics task to study the history of letters or newspapers as such. However, if we look at the following examples, the following two examples, we can see immediately how discourse traditions and grammar can be related. Brazilian Portuguese is the only Romance language that shows bare nominals in positions like example 6. Artigo defendendo essa tese foi recentemente publicado pela Folha de São Paulo. This is something strange, this kind of bare nominals, bare nouns. We won't find similar examples in other Romance languages. Other Romance languages allow for such constructions in headlines of newspapers or in certain telegraphic textual traditions. This somehow weird example as other bare nominal examples, also with definite reference from Brazilian Portuguese, first presented in 2002, caused some discussion among linguists. But after several publications and the thesis of Albert Wall and Ligia Rospancini, we now know more about these cases. If we look at the frequency of bare nouns in Brazilian Portuguese, we can observe that bare nominals, like the example 6, are very scarce in the written language, but not so seldom in newspapers. We know that there is something like the grammar of headlines as a discipline, and the grammar of headlines is a kind of a specific grammar for a specific discourse tradition. We think, however, that this is not only an example for the relationship between discourse tradition and grammar. This is an example that may stand for others. And this observation should make us think about if there's not much more, if this is not a much more general phenomenon. If we have a look at the Brazilian tradition of writing letters in the 19th century, we can observe how the new grammar with the form você enters or becomes more and more generalized as an address form, and this is accompanied by the increasing obligatoriness of subject pronouns, and this is penetrating the grammar not in an overall sense, but from text to text. And as Celia Lopez showed, even within the letters, there are loci that are more sensitive for the new grammar than others. Here we have an example of the horizontality of a letter where the form você only appears at the end. So there is a tradition, an old tradition and a new tradition within the same letter. What we can see with these examples is already enough for the first delimitation of what discourse traditions are. Discourse traditions are, very roughly spoken, relationships between textual models created in particular situations and the repetition of these models in situations that are somehow analogous. You have here the timeline from the left to the right, and you have a text 1 linked to the situation 1 and a text 2 in an analogous situation 2. And we call this evocation, the situation, the repetition of the situation and the text provoke an evocation of the previous situation. The important point is here that by definition, discourse traditions are related to memory and repetition. When we say something, that's the basic idea, we do not continuously create new utterances only according to our expressive necessities and according to our grammar and lexicon, but we also, and very frequently, simply repeat something already produced in similar circumstances. When we meet our neighbor in the morning in Brazil, we say bom dia, because we know the tradition of what to say in this particular circumstance. We could say something like desejo-lhe dia bom or dia bom para você, but we don't do it normally. We simply say bom dia. And if we do something different, it will be a marked construction, a marked expression that contrasts with the normally expected bom dia. This is nothing but pragmatics, one could oppose, but it is not. The situation of an encounter might pragmatically create the wish to utter something sympathetic to our interlocutor. Even if I doubt that this is universal, I would obviously deny that the specific formula is only a result of the pragmatics of that particular moment. The formula implies repetition and tradition, and it implies that to speak is not only to produce utterances according to lexicon and grammar. This all sounds so absolutely simple that we must ask ourselves why there is any need to mention it. But we need to mention it due to an evolution of linguistics in the 20th century. If we go back to the 19th century, we find predominantly a historical view in linguistics. For the German linguist Hermann Paul, one of the leaders of the neo-grammarian movement, linguistics necessarily had to be historical. As we will see, I basically agree with Hermann Paul, even if I do so in a different way. Ferdinand de Saussure, who is generally considered to be the founder of modern linguistics, insisted, at least this is what we attribute to his thought, even if we know that the Cours de Linguistique Générale had not been written by himself, by Saussure himself. He insisted on the synchronic character of language and postulated linguistics to stress mainly on synchronic analysis. In the cours, we find this statement, car la langue est un système de pure valeur que rien ne détermine en dehors de l'état momentané de ses termes. Language is a system of pure values which are determined by nothing except the momentary arrangement of its terms. That means language is purely synchronic. And this is obviously a provocation against 19th century historical linguistics. Le linguiste, says Saussure, ne peut entrer dans la conscience des sujets parlants qu'en supprimant le passé. The linguist can only enter into the consciousness of the speaking subject by suppressing the past. So Saussure postulates that linguists who only worked through the whole 19th century and even before historically, and only analyzed etymologies and historical evolutions of language should try to to create a completely different look at language, a completely synchronic look, because for language speakers, the past is not there. They are not historians of the language. They just speak the language in their synchronic actuality. Synchronism is absolutely dominant in 20th century linguistics. It is dominant in the different structuralist schools along the century, and this does not change neither with the arrival of generative grammar, nor with pragmatics, sociolinguistics, or with cognitive linguistics. There are, of course, numerous attempts to include historical views in several of these approaches. I will later refer to grammaticalization, for example, but generally synchronic and diachronic linguistics or historical linguistics used to appear as two completely different fields with a clear dominance of the synchronic view. Already short after the publication of Saussure's cours, there was a lot of criticism against this separation of synchrony and diachrony, but the mainstream of linguistics accepted the priority of synchronic linguistics. In the 1950s, Eugenio Coserio published in Montevideo his seminal book, Sincronía, Diacronía, Historia, where he strongly criticized the separation of both views, of synchronic and diachronic linguistics, claiming that it was only methodological and not real, and that synchrony was just a projection of language on a stable screen. So the question why languages change it was not a legitimate one in Coserio's view, since language change is an intrinsic characteristic of language. The problem only arises once we compare projections in different diachronic stages. As Coserio put it, what is interpreted as linguistic change is the historical objectivation of what has been produced in speech. That is to say, nothing other than language as it is being created. This is a quotation from the paper, the short paper, Linguistic Change Does Not Exist, from 1982, which is a very, very short attempt to give a resumed version of Sincronia, Diachronia, Historia, which was published in 1957, as I said, in Montevideo. For Coserio, language is a historical phenomenon. Speakers speak a language historically given. They make themselves part of the history of a particular language by speaking it. However, the historicity of a language is basically understood as the historicity of a language system, which is overcome by the language speaker once she or he assumes the system as a technique. This means that linguistic historicity is understood by Coserio basically as the competence of a language system, an idea not far away from the assumption of an état de langue in the sense of Saussure, or from a synchronic competence in a generative view. Coserio distinguishes three aspects of human language, three levels of considering language: a universal one, prior to the distinction of particular languages. All languages are systems of signs with arbitrary meaning, for example. A historical one of the particular language, for example, Portuguese, English, German, etc. And an individual one of what he calls text, no matter if written or oral, or discourse. Here, it's about concrete utterances and its concrete and their concrete pragmatic sense, including implicatures and contextual determination. This very simple three-level distinction is, according to Coserio, his most important contribution to linguistics. However, it has been criticized as insufficient by Peter Koch, a German linguist who introduced in 1987 the concept I'm talking about, the concept and the term of discourse tradition. The idea had been formulated a few years earlier by Brigitte Schlieben-Lange, whose basic ideas on the history of text were also published in Brazilian Portuguese. According to Koch, Coserio's historical level should be divided into two: the level of idiomatic historicity, that is to say, the grammar and lexicon of a language, and the level of discourse tradition, of repetition of texts. To speak would be, in this view, a universal ability of human beings expressed in historically given languages, history 1, grammars and lexicons, according to certain traditional ways of speaking, historical 2, and this would lead to the production of individual, unique texts or discourses. In fact, what Peter Koch adds to Coserio's conception is already mentioned by Coserio in his early Montevideo writings in the 1950s. For Coserio, what defines humans is not the tradition in the sense of pure repetition, but rather the primary linguistic historicity of the language. For Coserio, what Peter Koch calls discourse tradition would be the historicity of the individual level, and the universality of the historical language, historical level, which is investigated by universal grammar on the one hand, and pragmatics on the other hand. So we have in Coserio's scheme here a different conceptualization of what discourse traditions could be. But no matter where we situate the phenomenon of textual tradition or textual traditionality in a theoretical perspective, we must admit that the phenomenon as such is obvious, and it must be taken into account in different fields. There are different areas of applications. The first area of application used to be historical linguistics. There are many publications on discourse traditions and its relationship to historical linguistics, generating a critical view on corpus linguistics, on historical corpus linguistics. There are numerous publications in different languages. So if we think about how traditionally historical linguistics or historical corpus linguistics was conceived in a rather naive way by some schools, it corresponded to the model we see here on the screen. If we don't distinguish different varieties or discourse traditions, we might think that the relationship between texts and diachrony is a simple and causal one, and we simply have to choose texts from different periods, and then we have the representativity of the language of that particular moment. In the scheme, you see the timeline, the time arrow, and you see that at a particular moment, a text is considered to be representative for the language at that time. Let's take text 1 from the 13th century, text 2 from the 14th century, text 3 from the 15th, text 4 from the 16th, and text N, so on and forth. So here we think that it doesn't matter which kind of text we choose, because we will only find diachronic variation in the texts. This is, of course, a rather naive view, and we need to introduce some further distinctions in order to get closer to a more differentiated diachrony of texts. And we go back to Peter Koch and his partner in several publications, Wulf Österreicher, both created or published in 1985 a seminal paper which distinguished two kinds of speaking or writing: the language of immediacy and the language of distance. Koch and Österreicher identified a series of parameters that show the difference between two different modes of speaking or writing, and that determine our language activity continuously. They try to relate these two extremes of the dimension of immediacy and distance with graphic and phonic realizations, because they see that in those societies where writing exists, writing is more strongly linked to texts of distance than to texts of immediacy. The phonic realizations are more likely to be to represent texts of immediacy than texts of distance. This scheme, which is the English translation I found in a paper by Alessandra Castillo, is just enumerating a few of these parameters Koch and Österreicher identify to establish the continuum between immediacy and distance. And you will probably find it intuitively quite convincing what this difference is. They distinguish different degrees of publicity: the more private character of immediacy and the more public character of distance. For example, a large number of interlocutors and the public character makes a language be more distant, and a private conversation is more immediate. the degree of intimacy between the interlocutors, the degree of emotionality. More emotion is more on the side of immediacy, and a low degree of emotion on the side of distance. The degree of dependence on the immediate situation, strong dependence, immediacy, low dependence, distance. The point of reference of communication, physical proximity of the speakers, the degree of cooperation, the degree of dialogicity, immediacy is much more dialogic, the distance is much more monologue, there's more likely to be monologue, the degree of spontaneity, and the degree of thematic fixation. So there are even more parameters. This is an open list, but what we can see here is roughly what has been called are different degrees of planning, of formality of speech. We could roughly say this corresponds to formal and informal speech. So informal speech would be the language of communicative immediacy, and formal speech the language of communicative distance. And here you can see again these triangles that are triangles of frequency. The more we go closer to the pole of communicative distance, the more we will find written texts, and the closer we are to the pole of immediacy, the more we will find phonically realized text. This is not so obviously in those societies where no writing exists, but distance and immediacy are conceived as universal parameters which also work in societies without writing. Now, Koch and Österreicher elaborate on that, and they combine the view of immediacy and distance with the notion of discourse tradition, which was created by Peter Koch, as I said, in '87. And they say that discourse traditions are in fact ways of realizing language between immediacy and distance. Here you have these Arabic numbers, which can be on the phonic or on the graphic side. And for example, number 1 would be an informal oral conversation. Number 9 at the other extreme would be, for example, a philosophical written essay or a juridical text. And something like a more spontaneous talk would be in the middle, or a university talk would be in the middle of both, more elaborated, and you also have graphic immediate texts, for example, comics and maybe WhatsApp messages or whatever. So what I propose generally is to turn this scheme around and to correlate it with a traditional view on language. We know, for example, from Labovian linguistics, where we have changes from above and changes from below. So we try to combine the Koch-Österreicher scheme with the above-below metaphor. And this allows us also to introduce the time arrow. As you know, in our societies, time is conceived from the left to the right, which is, of course, dependent on the direction of our writing. In other societies, this doesn't work in the same way. And once we have introduced the time arrow, we can introduce more arrows, because we can say that all these discourse traditions, which are marked here by the Arabic numbers, correspond to have their own history. So the history of a language, the diachrony of a language, would be in fact not a single line, but a combination of traditions of different texts. And the innovation, for example, in language would not be an innovation in the whole language at the same time, but in a text or in a textual tradition. And then there could be spreading from one tradition to another, like in these very simplistic and reduced schemes of the dotted arrows. If we look at a language, at the history of the language, we generally do it by looking at a corpus. We just want to show here that a corpus is only a small window, maybe even much smaller, a small window on the history of a language, and we don't really study the history of the language, but rather a small part of what the language history offers us. Now, once we have introduced this more differentiated view on language history, we can relate this to different kinds of evolutions. For example, to grammaticalization. Grammaticalization is traditionally conceived as in those two schemes. We have a certain element, x1, that becomes diachronically x2 or x3. This conception of the history of a language is very strongly marked by the tradition of neo-grammarians, of phonetical laws of the 19th century, because here we have a really diachronic view. We compare stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. For example, if we look at the future periphrases in the Romance languages, which derive from a Latin amare habeo, and which become then amar e or amare in Portuguese. And this would be stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 grammaticalization of a future periphrases. Sometimes in grammaticalization studies, we look at parallel cycles of grammaticalization. For example, in the case of the future, we can also look in parallel at the second cycle of grammaticalization of the ir periphrase with the movement verb vou fazer, which is the second candidate for future, for the expression of future in Portuguese. For example, we have amare habeo, or which becomes amare, and on the other side we have vou amar as a second cycle of grammaticalization. But we don't normally look in a very differentiated way at textual traditions when we do grammaticalization studies. Let us look at 3 different prototypical cases of grammaticalization and its relation to discourse tradition. This is one of the traditional schemes in this work by Poplak and Malvar, where we see a typical case of a change from below. The change from below, in this case, is precisely what I just mentioned, the emergence of the future periphrases with the movement verb ir, vou fazer. In Brazilian Portuguese, you have the S-curve, the typical S-curve evolution, something that is emerging quite slowly and then going up quite quickly and then conquering the whole language, and other phenomena are declining at the same time. So we have a typical case of a change from below and an increasing form in the history of the language. And we can also distinguish, as the authors did, between spoken and written data, at least for the 20th century. You see here 20th century plays and oral corpora. Now, if we relate this to our scheme of the history of the language and the differentiation of discourse traditions, we will see that what happened here was, in fact, the spread from one discourse tradition to another, from discourse tradition of orality, of the immediacy, to discourse tradition of distance. So the grammaticalization of vou fazer in Brazilian Portuguese is, in fact, not just an S-curve in the language. This is the abstract projection of what happened in the history of the language. But if we look a little bit closer and at the texts where this form appears, we can identify this movement from below and this spread from below to the generality it has achieved in present times. But this is not the only prototypical evolution. We also have what Labov called the change from above. Change from above, which I will show with an example I did in a joint work with David Gerards, where we looked at the grammaticalization of the conditional conjunction in Portuguese, caso. In Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, you can say something like caso você case, in case you marry. We have here caso, which is originally a noun as in English case, as a conditional conjunction. Without any further marker, there is no other conjunction, it's just caso as a conjunction. So caso is or has become a conditional conjunction in Portuguese, first in Brazilian Portuguese, as we will see. We know, of course, this kind of prepositional constructions. This is also a discourse tradition because it's transversal, and you can see that it appears in different languages. Prepositional constructions like em caso de. Em caso de despressurização da cabine, máscaras cairão automaticamente à sua frente. Typical discourse tradition of flight attendants. We have this in English. I'm sure you've heard sage advice from flight attendants 100 times. In case of loss in cabin pressure, put your own breathing mask on first, then help children or something. In case of a loss. And we have this also in Spanish. En caso de despresurización de la cabina, se abrirán los compartimentos encima de sus asientos que contienen las mascarillas de oxígeno. Or in German, im Fall eines Druckverlustes fallen automatisch Sauerstoffmasken aus der Kabinendecke. German is an interesting case because in German we have an analogous grammaticalization. The word Fall, which appears here, case, Fall, also grammaticalized and became conditional conjunction false. But let's go back to Portuguese. If we look at the origin of caso in Portuguese, we can see that in the 13th and in the 14th century, almost all the examples we can find of caso are can be found in distant text from juridical discourse traditions. Of course, you can criticize now that there is a corpus bias because in the medieval times we don't have oral texts and we have a very low range of textual variation, and there is of course a juridical bias. But if we look at other texts like chronicles or more or literature, we don't find first instances of caso. The evolution, the overall evolution is this. We have caso, then the prepositional construction in caso que. Later we have no caso que, a construction that dies out. Caso que, afterwards a pure caso as a conjunction. Now, interestingly, this new grammaticalization step towards the conjunction appears mainly in Brazil. If we look at the authors in the Corpus do Português who use this form, this reduced form caso as a conjunction, we can see that they are all from Brazil. So what we have here is an element that is born in a juridic tradition and then further grammaticalized in Brazil and spreads then from Brazil to other varieties of Portuguese. The overall scheme would be this one. We have caso at the origin with a bias for juridical discourse traditions in the 13th and 14th century. We have then different constructions, in caso que, no caso que. Some of them die out and then are replaced by others. And then from the 18th century onwards, we have the conjunction caso, which first spreads towards immediacy in Brazilian Portuguese, and then later is adopted also in European Portuguese, and then spreads to immediacy also in European Portuguese. So this is a clear case where we can show that Brazilian Portuguese previously grammaticalized an element that later on was adopted by other varieties. The scheme we can find here is just the opposite of what we had before in the Poblak Malvar example of the S-curve from below. This is a change from above, a change that is created in juridic traditions and then spreads continuously towards immediacy. This is, of course, a simplified scheme, but this is a general scheme for this kind or this type of evolution. A third type of evolution would be a double change from below with innovation and loss. An example could be the Catalan negation particle pas. Pas, which is analogous to a French pas or pas, Old French pas, which becomes pas in modern French and becomes the negation mark, je l'aime pas. In Catalan, this pas also is born in immediacy as the French pas, as a reinforcing element for negation, but then it spreads more and more from immediacy to distance, but then it remains in distance and it disappears in immediacy. So in our days, pas has become a marker of that language of distance. This frequently happens, that elements remain only in the language of distance. We have many examples of this, like if we look at certain verbal forms in French, or at the subjunctive future forms in Spanish, or other forms which remain only in the language of distance and only in very particular traditions. So, are there other cases? We can also imagine other scenarios. These three were just maybe three prototypical ones where we can show the relationship between discourse tradition and historical grammar. Obviously, we cannot explain all our cases of historical grammar where the evolution is not a regular one by discourse tradition influence. Discourse traditions should not serve as a deus ex machina, as an overall explanation for any case in the history of language. Last year, we had a meeting in the largest, worldwide largest project on historical syntax of a Romance language, in this case of the Spanish language, a meeting in Mexico where frequently historical evolutions that could not be explained were attributed to discourse tradition phenomena with different terms, but we could maybe subsume this all under the label of discourse traditions. See, there was mentioned alternancias debidas al estilo, género, registro, tradición discursiva, alternatives that are due to style, genre, register, discourse tradition, efecto de los textos, text effects. And in one paper, someone said, I don't believe that this is an evolution of the system, but it seems to be an artifact of text types, or certain uses are associated with foros or forais, fueros in Spanish. There is a strong dependency of the texts. Cabe pensar que no todos los géneros o todas las temáticas se prestan por igual al uso de las construcciones medias. We should think that not all genres or all subjects, all issues are equally suitable for medial constructions. Someone talked about sophisticated stylistic devices. A register is seen as one of the main factors, and sometimes even there is insistence on that certain textual sequences should be considered even under the level of genre. So not only the genre globally, but something like a sub-genre. So we see that historical linguistics or historical syntacticians are really looking for explanations where discourse traditions could help. But obviously we must study the history of texts, and we must show that discourse traditions are really the responsible factor for this or that evolution. We also can ask ourselves if there are different areas of grammar more or less affected by the influence of discourse traditions. If there is something like a grammatical core and periphery, core phenomena less affected by discourse tradition, and peripheral phenomena more strongly affected by discourse traditions. If we look at the different cases, for example, the position of adjectives in the history of Spanish, we can find a very strong bias relatable to discourse traditions. If we look at other phenomena like differential object marking in the history of Spanish, it's very difficult to see discourse traditional bias. It seems to be a phenomena rather independent from discourse traditions. Other phenomena like there is an incipient, or there's something like a partitive determiner in the history of Spanish, in medieval Spanish, which almost only appears in certain textual traditions, as David Gerard shows in his thesis. So we have probably different cases more affected by discourse traditionality and cases less affected. So what we should try to create is a kind of a typology of those linguistic phenomena that are more likely to be affected by discourse traditions and others that are more stable. Of course, this can also vary in the history of a language. We can have periods where a phenomenon, like let's take again differential object marking in Spanish, is not seems not to be affected by discursive traditionality, and other periods where it becomes stronger involved in discourse traditional factors. But what I want to say towards the end of my talk is that discourse traditions are not only an issue for historical grammar. As we have seen, language is a historical phenomenon, and traditionality marks language at any moment. So we also have to look at other areas of language, and why not at language as it is produced in present. There is a clear relationship between discourse tradition and pragmatics. If we look, for example, at address systems, we can see that address forms and address systems frequently are described in terms of their pragmatics or in terms of their grammaticality. For example, the possibilities of distinctions a language offers between different address forms. But if we look, for example, at the expansion of tú in Spanish after 1968, or the expansion of tú in German after 1968, or the expansion of the form você in Brazilian Portuguese in the 19th century, or of tu in 18th century French, we can see that this is not really something due to a purely grammatical evolution, but rather to new discursive traditions. For example, students who started to expand the use of the less distant marked form after the student revolution of the 68. So we have a very strong relationship here between discourse tradition and address forms. And I think basically the study of address forms cannot be separated from traditionality and should not be limited to only the grammatical and the pragmatic aspect. In general, it is useful to distinguish between pragmatics and discourse traditions. Discourse traditions generally have a pragmatic origin. Then from this pragmatic starting point, there might be a possible traditionalization, and then discourse traditions achieve an autonomous semiotic value. As we can see in the example of the stay healthy in COVID-19 times, we have a pragmatic origin, a possible traditionalization, and then a certain formula can achieve an autonomous semiotic value. But discourse traditions are also relevant for societies, because we can find the use of different discourse traditions in different groups. Groups define themselves not only by linguistic features like phonemes or morphemes or lexical items, they also define themselves by different traditions of texts they use, by rituals, which also can be non-linguistic, and we see an intimate relationship between linguistic traditionality and extra-linguistic traditionality. This is also why discourse traditions are maybe not the most central human differentiating issue, but rather something that accompanies what is the definition phenomenon of human beings. Human language is grammar and its lexicon. We can see that the knowledge of certain forms by speakers from different social strata leads to a clear social stratification, and that the access to prestigious social groups is clearly determined by the knowledge of certain discourse traditions. So discourse traditions are also important for the social stratification of a society. If we think about the eternal discussion about Brazilian Portuguese and the so-called gramática da língua, we frequently discuss grammatical items and grammatical incorrectness or so-called incorrectness, but it should also we should also think that the gramática da língua is a matter also of discourse traditions. There is a social enclosure through discourse traditions that only certain groups in the society really know. And there can be, as always, two ways of solution. One could be the destigmatizing of discourse tradition, of the discourse tradition that discourse traditions that are stigmatized, or the granting of access to prestigious discourse traditions through education. So I would like to conclude. I hope the concept of discourse tradition and its importance for linguistics has become more or less clear, at least partially. My aim was not to offer an alternative view on language, but rather to show that discourse traditions are an overall present phenomenon and that they should be taken into account when doing linguistics. There is no contradiction between the approach of studying discourse traditions and other approaches that study grammatical phenomena, for example. It is rather a suggestion to take traditionally of language seriously into account and to look at effects on language that are due to textual traditions. As we have seen by the end, there is a vast field of issues that goes far beyond historical grammar. Discourse traditions are everywhere, and discourse traditions are bridging cultural and linguistic approaches to language. discourse tradition studies should not remain as a separated field as happens sometimes. There should be an integral view on language, on grammar, as well as on textual traditionality. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado pela atenção. And here you have a nice photo from taken from our university at Zurich. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Kabatek, for the amazing talk. We are very thankful for it. And now we have some questions. And I would like to start to begin this question session with the question from Kleber Ataide. Kleber asks, Kabatek, de que forma o modelo teórico das tradições discursivas colocam em questionamento o princípio unidirecional da mudança linguística?
This is a very interesting question. Quer que fale em português ou continuo em inglês?
Eu acho que quando faz a pergunta em português, responde em português. E se a pessoa fizer em inglês, se for estrangeiro, aí responde em inglês, não é? Não sei, cadê o Miguel?
Sim. Bem, essa é uma boa pergunta, porque o princípio da unidirecionalidade realmente é um princípio que fica bem claro numa concepção unidirecional de uma língua. Mas é verdade quando a linguística histórica faz a distinção não só de tradições discursivas, mas também de variedades linguísticas, a unidirecionalidade às vezes não é tal. Por exemplo, na história do português sabemos que no português Portugal sabemos que na posição dos críticos, desde a época medieval, o português Portugal tende a próclise do mesmo jeito, igual que o português brasileiro. Só que depois da época clássica, o português de Portugal volta à posição enclítica, volta para a situação medieval. Então, aqui temos um caso claramente de não é uma curva unilineal, mas ir e voltar para uma situação anterior. Então, isso tem a ver com tradições discursivas? Provavelmente sim, porque na imagem que a gente tem da história do português Portugal, o corpus está marcado provavelmente numa época determinada por textos que favorecem a proclise e depois aparecem outros textos, digamos, temos uma copresença de duas gramáticas, por assim dizer, e depois volta à gramática anterior. Ou seja, uma visão mais diferenciada, por um lado, de variedades linguísticas copresentes, como também de tradições discursivas, pode explicar casos de ir e vir na história da língua que não é unilineal, como seria o esperável numa língua, entre aspas, homogênea. Mas as línguas não são tão homogêneas como parece. Não sei se respondi a pergunta, mas mais ou menos é isso.
I think you have answered. People are clapping. So, there is a second question from Eric Franco, and he asks, Kabatek, do you think we can make use of the notion of discourse traditions from a synchronic point of view and a language acquisition point of view?
Absolutely. As I said at the end, obviously, discourse traditions are not only something for the history of the language. We learn, we acquire discourse traditions. We do not only acquire a language as such. And of course, language acquisition is a very interesting field. If we look at the relationship between at this scheme of immediacy and distance, we can roughly say that the first language acquisition is in the field of immediacy. The little child does not read juridical or philosophical texts usually. So there are phases of acquisition, and a part of what we call the text of distance are somehow phenomena that are part of something we could call second language acquisition within our first language. So the first language, let's take Portuguese, for example. You have you grow up with the language with your so-called mother tongue, but at a certain stage you learn constructions, you learn how to manage texts that are really something like learning a foreign language. We could maybe even remember the famous poem by Carlos Drummond de Andrade, O Português são dois, não é? Where the second Portuguese is a Portuguese acquired in a late phase, whereas the mother tongue is the first acquisition with a partly different grammar.
Okay. The third question is about the location of discourse traditions on the historical level or on the individual level. You mentioned that Cosério and Petacor, they don't have the same view. That Cosério understands that the discourse traditions are a historicity of the individual level, and that Petacor understands that this kind of historicity is on the historical level. So Petacor justifies the second historicity, affirming that the individual level cannot know any rules. So I would like to know, what do you think about this justification? In other words, who's right, Petacor or Cosério?
In a way, both are right. I think what Cosério wanted to show is that the really particular thing about the historical level is this possibility of internalization of a grammar and a lexicon. This possibility to create something new, the language as a technique, as a free technique. And this is in a way superior and more particularly human than just the repetition. So there is a kind of a hierarchy that the linguistic historicity is the primary historicity, and the discourse traditions are you can find traditionality also without language, like the traditionality of wearing certain clothes or things like that. So traditionality is not language specific. We have traditionality all over the place. But what Koch says is true in a way. Both are very close, and it's really a very, very little difference between both. What Koch says is true when he says that the individual level is only the level of the individual utterance. But Cosério precises already in the 1950s and in his writing about text linguistics that this individual utterance can also have or also has its own historicity. And he gives exactly examples that later appear in Peter Koch's work as discourse traditions, like formula of greeting formula or certain text types. And he also says already, Coserius says, that these are not really linked to a special, to a particular grammar. These are independent in a way of traditions that are independent of the grammar of a language. So we acquire these elements like a formula like bon dia is something that we really acquire as a text as such. So both coincide when we look at the phenomena. Maybe they don't coincide with respect to the exact location in theory. For Coseriu, the traditionality of the individual level is a traditionality, as I would say, of ergon, of a result of an uttered text that can be repeated. And on the historical level of language, we have the energeia in the Humboldtian sense, the creativity of language, the assumed technique, which is an instrument of freedom for the creation of new texts. So in a way, repetition is not as free as the free creation, but we should at the same time not condemn discourse traditions only to stupid repetition, because obviously there is also a creativity in the way we repeat or we do not repeat texts, because sometimes we even consciously omit the repetition, or we are creative in just doing something different than the tradition would probably impose us. So tradition is not an imposition. Tradition is also another instrument for our freedom.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to say that many people are sending their congratulations. Cristina Salles says, muito bom, Johannes, grande abraço. And Marco Martins, parabéns ao Kabatek pela conferência, muito bom estar com todos os colegas. And there are no other questions, but I would like to make a last question. And it's related to what Eric Franco has asked you before. You mentioned that, yes, we have discourse traditions in the language acquisition and in other areas of linguistics and linguistic phenomena. So my question is, do you think that this discourse traditionality or this discourse traditionality perspective can be combined with other theoretical points of view? In other words, is this model of discourse tradition more like framework free? What do you think?
That's at least what I wanted to say. Framework free is maybe too much, because it's not really framework free, but it's framework adaptable or something like that. It can, because it's not a framework in a way, it's a phenomenon. The traditionality of language is simply a fact, and nobody will deny that. We have different terms for that, and these different terms highlight different aspects. For example, we can talk about text types, about genre, about formula, and these are of course not the same. It's not all the same, but these are phenomena that are related to traditionality of texts. But the traditionality of language, the repetition, the fact that language is not only creation of new things, but that it's that there is intertextuality, there is repetition, and that this repetition is also semiotically important, that it has its own semiotic value. That's absolutely obvious. So I wouldn't claim it to be something that is restricted to a kind of a small group of people who are the discourse traditionalists and like a kind of a sectarian movement. I think it's simply important to recognize that discourse traditions are a phenomenon that is there. And then everybody has to ask or should be open-minded enough to ask him or herself if it's relevant for a particular approach. For example, what is the relationship between grammar and discourse tradition? And I try to give some examples. I think there is a clear relationship. What is the relationship between discourse traditions and acquisition? Of course, those who work in language acquisition will find better answers than my spontaneous one, but I think there is a clear relationship. And others who work in other frameworks will also be probably intrigued by the importance of discourse traditions in their field. But obviously discourse traditions, and that was my conclusion, discourse traditions are everywhere, and maybe more than we generally think.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kabatek, for this amazing talk. It was very enlightening for me and for many people. Valéria Gomes says, parabéns, Kabatek, pela excelente conferência. Aura Zavan também. Estou muito contente de reencontrar vocês. So many people on the YouTube chat are sending their congratulations for the talk and saying that it was very good. And but since there are no more questions, I would like to know if you want to say some final words to the audience. And I would also like to thank you for the talk. It's been a great pleasure to hear you. I also would like to thank everybody participating on YouTube. And don't forget to join the next lectures and participate with comments and likes. Please hit the button. And thanks also to Abralin ao Vivo for this great opportunity. So with this, I wish you all a nice week, and I turn it to Kabatek for the final words.
First of all, thank you very much, Alessandra, also for this discussion and thank you all for being here. It's a kind of a strange feeling, I must admit, because I don't see you, and I think this is a technical revolution, obviously, but I would also enjoy to be with all of you and to discuss with you, and maybe after the talk to have a beer and go on talking about discourse tradition and other issues. Então, realmente foi grande prazer estar com todos vocês e desejo para todas e todos saúde, muita saúde. We hope you will stay healthy, safe and healthy. As Alessandra said, we already have this discursive formula. Thank you very much for the attention, and I hope to see you soon, and maybe in another more direct way. Good night and bye-bye. Thank you.